The pressures of inflation feel unprecedented, a uniquely modern crisis. But what if they are not? What if currency debasement is a predictable, systemic response to a specific set of state pressures? The Roman Empire provides a near-perfect laboratory to test this model. It demonstrates that the path from fiscal stability to hyperinflation is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual, often invisible, erosion of trust. Now, let's open the historical ledger and analyze the economic blueprint this crisis left behind. For over 2 centuries, the Roman denarius was more than just coinage. It was the fundamental transmission mechanism for the economic lifeblood of the Western world. From the shores of Britannia to the markets of Syria, its value was unquestioned. Why? Because its intrinsic value was stable. If we analyze the composition of a denarius from the time of Augustus, as shown in this metallurgical analysis, we find a silver purity consistently approaching 98%. This was not merely a matter of material worth. This was a physical manifestation of a social contract. This system's stability wasn't just economic, it was psychological. It was the metric against which all value is measured. A legionary's pay, a contract for grain from Egypt, an inheritance, all were denominated in a unit of account that was perceived as permanent. This perception of permanence is the bedrock of any complex economy. It is what allows for long-term planning, investment, and the accumulation of capital beyond a single generation. The denarius was the psychological anchor of the Roman mind, a promise of stability from the state to its citizens. This stability enabled complex, long-distance trade, sophisticated credit markets, and the funding of the legions that guaranteed the Pax Romana. The system was in equilibrium, predictable state expenses, reliable tax revenues, and a sound currency. This equilibrium, however, was predicated on a balance of fiscal discipline. The call to adventure for our analysis, the inciting incident that knocks the system from its stable state, was not a foreign invasion, but a domestic crisis. In 64 AD, the Great Fire of Rome incinerated a vast portion of the capital. The Emperor Nero, driven by ambitious reconstruction projects and extravagant personal spending, faced a critical fiscal gap. The state's options were limited. It could raise taxes, but this was politically toxic and slow. It could confiscate wealth, an act of destabilizing tyranny. Or it could employ a third, more insidious option, one hidden from the public eye. Nero chose to change the money itself. He reduced the silver content of the denarius from nearly 98% to around 5%, and the gold aureus was likewise lightened. This was not a minor adjustment. This was the first programmatic, state-level debasement of the Roman currency. What Nero did was sever the link between the symbol of value and the substance of value. He demonstrated that the state, the guarantor of the currency, could also be its primary predator. This act introduced a new, corrosive variable into the Roman economic equation: counterparty risk with the government itself. The immediate effect, as we can see in the state's ledgers, was a resounding success. For the state, Nero could now mint more coins from the same amount of silver, funding his new golden house and the rebuilding of the city without a corresponding tax hike. The trap was set, and it was twofold. First, there was an information asymmetry. To the average merchant or soldier, the coins looked identical. The state, as the sole issuer and validator of the currency, exploited the public's trust in the form of the money, even as it corrupted its substance. Second, and more critically, it established a precedent. Debasement was now a viable tool of state policy. The emergency measure became a fiscal addiction. The ordinary world of stable money was over, even if the citizens didn't know it yet. This new tool was irresistible. The pressures on the state only grew. We see this pattern accelerate under Trajan. His successful wars in Dacia brought in a massive influx of gold, temporarily masking the problem. But his successor, Hadrian faced the costs of consolidating and defending a sprawling frontier. As this on-screen chart of silver content illustrates, the purity of the denarius began a slow but undeniable decline. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century, the pressures of constant border wars and the devastating Antonine plague forced his hand. The denarius was now only about 75% silver. From our vantage point, this is a clear downward trend. But for a Roman living through it, this was a 130-year process. The degradation was just slow enough to be normalized. The state was effectively imposing an invisible, incremental tax on every citizen who held its currency. They were expropriating public wealth, not through legislation, but through metallurgy. The 75% purity under Marcus Aurelius was a new low, but it was not the floor. The system was now primed for a catastrophic failure. The fiscal demands of the 3rd century would expose this hidden vulnerability and turn a slow decline into a complete system collapse. The structural integrity of the ordinary world was compromised, the foundations were cracked, and the state had just discovered a powerful but self-destructive hammer. The crisis of the 3rd century, beginning after the death of Marcus Aurelius, was the crucible that shattered this compromised system. This was the ordeal for the Roman economy. The period of the barracks emperors, with dozens of claimants to the throne in just 50 years, was not merely a political crisis. It was an existential fiscal catastrophe. Each new emperor, often raised by his legions, had one primary, non-negotiable expense: paying the army. The legions were the state's sole guarantor of power, and their loyalty was transactional. But with the empire fractured by civil war and borders collapsing, tax revenues were in freefall. The state's expenses had become exponential, while its income imploded. Faced with this impossible gap, the emperors turned to the only tool Nero had left them: the debasement of the currency. But they did so with a speed and aggression that made the earlier erosion look trivial. The ordeal begins with a fatal innovation. In 215 AD, the Emperor Caracalla introduced a new coin, the Antoninianus. This coin was, from its inception, a systemic fraud. It was valued by the state at 2 denarii, but as metallurgical analysis shows, it contained only the silver of 5 denarii. It was a blatant attempt to increase the money supply by 25% overnight. This act was the tipping point. It triggered a run on the old, purer currency. When we analyze coin hoards from this period, we see a clear pattern. Citizens began selectively removing the good denarii of Augustus and Trajan from circulation, paying for goods and taxes with the bad Antoniniani. This is a textbook example of Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good. The state, by injecting a fraudulent coin, had just signaled to the public that the currency was no longer a reliable store of value. The public, in response, began to price this risk into their transactions. And this is where the debasement spiral, the feedback loop, truly takes hold. Let's trace this loop, as it is the central mechanism of the collapse. Step 1. The state, desperate for silver, issues the Antoninianus. Step 2. The public hoards the old denarii, shrinking the actual supply of silver in circulation. Step 3. To get the silver it needs, the state must offer more debased coins for the good silver, or it simply mints new coins with even less silver. Step 4. This acceleration becomes visible. As we see in this on-screen chart, tracking the Antoninianus from 215 to 270 AD, the silver content plummets. What was 50% silver under Caracalla collapsed to 20% by the 250s, and by the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, it was as low as 2 to 5%. Step 5. The coin was now a lie. It was a copper or bronze disc given a silver wash that would rub off in days. The public was not fooled. The economic consequences of this truth becoming self-evident were catastrophic. This wasn't inflation. This was the evaporation of the concept of money itself. we see a rapid demonetization of the Roman economy. The value of the currency was falling so fast that a merchant who accepted coins for grain in the morning would find them worthless by evening. The medium of exchange function failed. As documented in Egyptian papyri from the era, prices for basic goods, wheat, barley, oil, did not just rise. They exploded, changing weekly. A measure of wheat that cost 200 drachmae, a rough equivalent, in the early 3rd century cost 120,000 by the 290s. When the medium of exchange fails, trust evaporates. The complex, empire-wide trade network that depended on the denarius seized up. A merchant in Spain would no longer accept a shipment of Antoninianus from a buyer in Rome, as the coins would be worthless by the time they arrived. The economy violently regressed. Long-distance trade collapsed, replaced by local barter. The state itself was the primary victim of its own policy. Soldiers, now paid in these worthless copper tokens, were effectively uncompensated. This led to mutinies, the murder of emperors, and further civil war, which in turn demanded more military spending, forcing the state to mint even more worthless coins. The spiral was now feeding on itself. Most critically, the state's tax base dissolved. No one would pay their taxes in valuable goods, grain, cattle, in exchange for worthless silver-wash tokens. The state was forced to bypass its own monetary system entirely. It instituted the annona militaris, a tax levied in kind. The government no longer collected money to buy grain for the legions. It collected the grain itself. It collected uniforms, boots, and weapons directly from producers. This was the ultimate admission of systemic failure. The Roman government had created a currency so toxic, it refused to accept it for its own taxes. This rebalancing forced the economy into a proto-feudal structure. Wealth was no longer held in financial assets, which had been inflated to zero, but in land and commodities, real, tangible assets that could not be debased by a mint. Society restructured itself around large, self-sufficient villas, latifundia, which operated as localized economies, completely detached from the imperial monetary system. The unified Roman economy was dead. The ordeal reaches its climax with the rebalancing of Emperor Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century. Diocletian, a brilliant systems analyst in his own right, inherited this shattered framework. He recognized that the Antoninianus was beyond saving and introduced new, pure coins. But he also understood that the root cause of the inflation was that the public had lost faith. He diagnosed the problem, but he misidentified the solution. He believed the problem was prices, not the money. In 301 AD, he issued his famous edict on maximum prices. This was one of the most comprehensive attempts at state-managed economics in history. The edict set fixed, non-negotiable prices for over 1,000 goods and services. A pound of pork, a day's labor for a bricklayer, a military-grade boot, even transport fees. The penalty for exceeding these prices? Death. The edict was Diocletian's attempt to command the old economic reality back into existence. It was an act of profound, authoritarian desperation, and it was an immediate and total failure. When we analyze the economic laws at play, the outcome was inevitable. By setting prices below the true market clearing price, Diocletian did not stop inflation. He stopped trade. Merchants, unable to sell their goods at a profit, simply removed them from the market. A farmer would rather let his grain rot in the field than transport it to the city to be sold at a state-mandated loss. Storefronts in cities across the empire were emptied overnight. Black markets, operating under the threat of execution, became the only markets. The edict, meant to cure scarcity, amplified it to the point of famine. It was the final, brutal lesson of the Roman ordeal. A state cannot legislate value. It cannot force its citizens to trust a currency it has itself destroyed. The rebalancing was not a restoration. It was a transformation into a rigid, command-and-control economy that would require Constantine to re-anchor the entire system, not on silver, but on a new, elite-only gold solidus, bifurcating the Roman world into two separate economies, one for the rich and one for everyone else. The journey from the high-purity denarius of Augustus to the worthless, silver-washed token of Gallienus is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a complete, data-rich blueprint of a currency's life cycle and its death. The Roman ordeal provides the elixir for our modern analysis, a predictive model for systemic debasement. When we distill the Roman data, a clear, four-stage framework emerges. This is the intellectual weapon we, as modern analysts, can now wield. Stage 1. The precedent. The crisis begins when a state, facing a short-term fiscal gap, Nero's fire, compromises the integrity of its currency as an emergency measure. This act severs the public's trust in the currency's substance and establishes debasement as a viable, hidden policy tool. Stage 2. The acceleration. The state's fiscal obligations become systemic and non-negotiable, the army's payroll. Debasement shifts from an emergency tool to the primary funding mechanism. This is marked by systemic fraud, Caracalla's Antoninianus, an official attempt to decree that bad money is equal to good. Stage 3. The behavioral sink. The public is no longer deceived. They recognize the fraud and Gresham's law takes full effect. Good money, intrinsic stores of value, are hoarded and vanish from circulation. The state, to get the resources it needs, must print even faster, chasing its own tail. This feedback loop is the debasement spiral, and it becomes visible to all. Stage 4. The systemic rejection. The currency's function as a medium of exchange and unit of account fails completely. The state itself is forced to bypass its own money, the annona militaris. The final act is a desperate attempt to control the symptoms, prices, through authoritarian command, Diocletian's edict, which only destroys the last remnants of the functional economy. This Roman blueprint is our return with the elixir. It allows us to analyze our modern world, not with fear, but with diagnostic clarity. Let us apply this framework. Our modern Nero moment, our stage 1 precedent, was arguably 1971 when the U.S. dollar's final link to its intrinsic anchor, gold, was severed. This was presented as a temporary, emergency measure to solve a fiscal gap. It permanently transformed the dollar into a pure fiat instrument, entirely dependent on institutional trust, not substance. What then is our Antoninianus? What is our stage 2 acceleration? When we analyze the central bank balance sheets following the 2008 financial crisis, and again in 2020, on-screen chart of central bank balance sheet expansion, we see the digital equivalent of Caracalla's decree. The policy of quantitative easing was the creation of trillions of new currency units by decree to fund systemic obligations. Like the Antoninianus, these new units were declared equal in value to the old, effectively diluting the entire supply. This brings us to today. We are now living inside stage 3, the behavioral sink. The public is visibly reacting. The inflation we experience is the symptom. The disease is the debasement. When we see the price of real assets, real estate, equities, commodities, alternative assets like cryptocurrencies, escalating rapidly, this is not a simple boom. This is the modern expression of Gresham's law. The public is fleeing the bad money, the currency that is being actively debased, and stampeding into good money, scarce, real assets that cannot be created ex nihilo by a central bank. They are hoarding the modern denarii. The Roman model shows us what to look for next. We must listen for the rhetoric of stage 4. When we hear policymakers propose interventions that blame the symptoms, attacking price gouging or windfall profits, or proposing price controls on essential goods, we are hearing the echo of Diocletian. We are hearing the state diagnose the problem as prices, when the problem is the money itself. This framework is the gift of history. It is the tool that allows the hero, our modern professional, to navigate uncertainty. The Roman blueprint does not grant us the power to change the systemic pressures, but it gives us something more valuable: foresight. It allows us to move from being a passive victim of economic chaos to an active, objective analyst. We can identify the stage we are in, anticipate the next move, and understand the difference between a state's stated intentions and the predictable consequences of its actions.